Today's daf is Mem Vav. We're going to start from daf Mem Hey Amud Sheni, about 10 lines. We're going to start about 10 lines from the wide line. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel. I want to point out to you some basic common shaila that we crossed yesterday in our learning. The Gemara said before, where my pointer is, that if you have a block, koifes means a block of dough, let's say, or yeast, sheyichada l'yeshiva, a big block of dough that you set it aside, that you're not going to eat it, use it for food, you're going to sit on it. So we learned yesterday that this big block of dough is batla. You don't have to get rid of it before Pesach. And we learned at the end of our learning yesterday that according to Rabbanan, you still have to plaster that dough. In other words, if it's plastered a little bit, painted on it, then you don't have to get rid of it. So this comes up very, very often. Suppose you have a grandkid who gives you a piece of artwork that she made in kindergarten, consisting of macaroni on a sheet of paper with it's painted over the macaroni. So before Pesach, you don't have to get rid of it, because if you set it aside that you're not going to eat it, you're just going to use it as artwork, that's okay. And also, sometimes you have pieces of wheat and pieces of barley that are just painted over, set aside as a flower arrangement of some side, also type of artwork. You don't have to get rid of it, and that's based on what we learned yesterday. That a big block of dough, if it's designated as a bench, you don't have to get rid of it before Pesach. Okay, now we're going to begin the Gemara. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel. Again, we're talking about the bowl, right? The bowl that had cracks, and we learned in the Mishnah that if there is a kezayis in the crack, let's assume that the dough is on the side, the crack is on the side wall, and the dough that's filling up the crack is the size of a kezayis, you have to get rid of it. That says the Mishnah. If it's less than a kezayis, then you don't have to get rid of it. You could leave it in the bowl over Pesach, and that's not a problem. Amar Rav Nachman, you're not over bal yirah bal yamatzeh. So Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel. What happens if you have shnei chatzoy zeisim? You have two half olive size. Okay, so they're in different sides of the bowl. But the chut shel batzek beinehem, there's a tiny strand of dough that connects the two half zeisim. So he says, Royin, we observe it, Kol she'ilu yinotal, you imagine that if you would take hachut, if you would hold up this strand, binitol and imoy, and the two half zeisim would come up with it. In other words, if you would hold it, and then on the two sides you'll have half a zayis, so then they're all connected, so it has a din like a zayis, like a one big zayis, and then chayiv levayer, you have to get rid of it. Then lav, if you can't lift it, in other words, if you estimate that you wouldn't be able to lift the two zaysim at the same time with this strand, ein chayiv levayer, you don't have to get rid of it, because we view them as separate entities, half a zayis and half a zayis. The Mishnah says you don't have to get rid of it. Now Ula says a massive chiddush. Ula says loy amran. Our Mishnah is talking about where the dough is in the elaba areva. The dough is in it ended up in your mixing bowl, right? So you have a dough filling up a crack in the mixing hole. Depends. If it's a kezayis, you have to get rid of it. You have to pull it out. And if not, you could leave it there. Avol babayis, if you have a half a kezayis in your house, chayiv levayer, you have to get rid of it. So let's say you have a half a kezayis in one corner of your house and a half a kezayis in another corner of your house. So you could argue and say that they're half a zaysim. I don't have to get rid of it. The Ula says you do have to get rid of it. My timer, what's the reason? The zimnen, because maybe the chonish luhu, you sweep them together, v'naflu gabe adodi, and you join them together. In other words, when you're going to sweep up the house, you're going to bring the two half of kazesim together, and they become one zayis. Therefore, you have to get rid of it. But Ula said, Boy b'marava. In Eretz Yisrael, they asked the question on this halacha. What happens? You have a bayis v'aliyah. You have an attic and the ground floor. And a half a zayis is in the ground floor, and a half a zayis is in the attic. Mahu, what would be the din? Do you have to get rid of it? Or you could leave it there because you're never sweeping from the attic down to the ground floor. Or bayis v'aksadra. If you have a house and a portico in front of it, mahu, what's the din? Sometimes you sweep them together. Most of the time you don't. You leave things on the portico outside the house, the porch outside the house. Shnei batim zeh lifnim zeh. If you have two houses, one between each other. In other words, one house, to enter the inner house, you have to go through the outer house. But very often you're not using the inner house. Most of the time you're using the outer house or the outer room, and you're not going so deep into your house. Mahu, what would be the din? Do you have to get rid of it? Or you can leave it there because at the end of the day, they're a half a zayis. And it's quite possible that you're not going to sweep them together so they won't become one zayis. Teiku, this becomes a question not resolved. The Gemara continues. Tana Rabbanim, the rabbis taught, Hapas ipsha, benifsala melachol la'adam. Listen to this. You have a bread that became moldy, and no human can eat it anymore. But the kelev, a dog, could eat it. Now, if this, let's say you have a treifa piece of meat that became moldy, that a human can't eat it, and a dog can eat it. So if a human eats it, it's not a problem because there's no isser of the vela on it, because it's nifsala lechol odom. A human can't eat it. Chametz is the only difference. Even if chametz is not edible for a human, if it's edible for a dog, it's still considered chametz. And therefore, on Pesach, it could not, if it's the size of an egg, it could receive tumah and transfer tumah if it's the size of an egg. Although it's moldy, still it has a din of food because it's on Pesach. We consider it as if it's food. Here's a chiddush that if it's truma tahora, right? Let's say this moldy piece of bread belonged to a kohen, and it was truma tahora. He's allowed to burn it with tameh truma or anything tameh on Pesach, because since the kohen can't eat it anymore because it's on Pesach, he found it on Pesach and he wants to burn it. He could be metama it directly and burn it with other truma things, even though he's metama the truma, since it's truma that you can't eat because it's chametz. So he's allowed to be metama it lechatchila. So that's the teaching of the Tanakama, that it's still considered food, chametz food, as long as a dog can eat it. Mishum Rab Nosson Amru, in the name of Rab Nosson, it was taught, Eina metama. It's not tuma. That's not tuma, and it's not considered food. So, come on, Oslo, who was taught this Mishnah? Who's the author of this Mishnah? Klal Amru B'Taharas. There's a rule concerning taharadik, pure food. Kol hameyuchad la'oichel adam. If it was designated to be used as human food, it could tameh. It always remain tameh, and it's considered food until it's no more edible for a dog. So who's that author? Come on, that author of that Mishnah is the loiker Rab Nosson. It's not like Rab Nosson, because Rab Nosson says that even when it's not edible for a human, it's considered not food anymore and would not be mekabel tumah. So that is not like Rabbi Nosson. One of the main concerns about giving kashrus on different items on Pesach, such as soap, shampoos, toothpaste, shoe polish, everything like that, is to determine if it's nifso ma'achilas kelev. Because sometimes you could have an item that might look like it's not edible for a dog, but it could be made edible to a dog. Because you could easily reverse the process. So if it has pieces of oats in there, it might, certain shampoos or thing like that, it might be chametz over a Pesach. Our neighborhood was zeicha to a big tzaddik, Rabbi Blumenkrantz, who dedicated his life's work determining what products are kosher to Pesach and what products should not be used on Pesach. Perfumes and colognes and everything is in that book. And he had to study the makeup of all these items to create his work. So it's based on this Gemara, because the Gemara teaches us that even though a human can't eat it, but if a dog could eat it, it still has a din of food. Tanu Rabbanim, our rabbis taught, Arevis Wabdomin, Shenosim L'Soichet Kamach. Let's say you have a bowl that's used to tan leather in there. Okay, so now it's an empty bowl, but it used to tan leather, and you put flour in there. So Toich Shloisha Yom, if it's 3 days before Pesach, even though the bowl is stinky, so therefore the kamach becomes stinky, but it's not defiled from human consumption, or even if it is, it still could be used by a dog. Chayiv levar, you have to get rid of that kamach, that flour that's in that bowl. The koidim shloshim yomim, if you put it into that bowl before 3 days, ein chayiv levar, you don't have to get rid of it because it stayed a long time in that smelly bowl. So therefore, that kamach became defiled not only for humans but even for dogs. Rav Nosson qualified it and said, what we're talking about, you didn't put any leather into that bowl. It's just the bowl itself that has a smell to it. But if you actually did put leather into that bowl, at the same time that you put the flour, you put a piece of leather in the bowl, that even within the 3 days, you don't have to get rid of it, because being in contact with that leather certainly spoils and rots the flour, and therefore it's unedible. So you're not mechuyev to get rid of it before Pesach. Rava said halacha Rav Nosson, halacha is like Rav Nosson, and he called even afilu yom echad, a day before Pesach, afilu sha'achas, 1 hour before Pesach. An hour before Pesach, you put flour, and you put on top of it into the bowl a piece of leather. That's it. The flour becomes unedible, and you don't even have to get rid of it before Pesach. Okay, that's what we learned. When it's without leather, it gets spoiled from the smell of the keli. But if you put oiris, says Rashi, bekamach bitlu metaris chametz, it comes nullified from being even called chametz anymore. Okay, now I want to go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah said right over here that if you have a batzek shebesitke areva, you have a dough that's in the cracks of a bowl. So it depends. If there was a olive in one spot, you have to take it out with a toothpick and get rid of it. If it's not, then you could leave it there. And let's assume that's in the side of the wall of the bowl. Then the Mishnah adds something else. If regarding Tumah, it has nothing to do with Kazayas. In Makbid Olav, if you're Makbid on it, Chaitzitz, it's considered like a Chatzitzit. It means it's not part of the bowl. If you're going to intend to take it out, then it's not part of the bowl. If you want it there, if you're going to want to leave it there, then it becomes part of the bowl. What's this talking about? And it seems to give you a different measurement. Here, the key word is kazayas or no kazayas. Here, the key word is it doesn't matter the size. It depends if you want it there or you're makbid. You don't want it there. So let's see what the Gemara says. So the Gemara says, what do you mean, mechein le'inyan tumah? Me, dummy, how can you compare tumah to chametz? Hasam b'shi'ur etalia milsa. Over there, by chametz, it depends on the size. If it's a kazayas or not a kazayas. Hacha, by tumah, big paid etalia milsa. The Gemara, the Mishnah says it has to do with if you're makpid, if you want it there or not. So how could you say mechein le'inyan tumah? Amar Rav Yehuda, so Rav Yehuda just corrected the Mishnah. Ema, you say in the Mishnah, inyan tumah ain't came. But the Mishnah means that tumah, you don't look at kazayas and not kazayas, and that solves a problem. So basically, Rav Yehuda just changed the language of the Mishnah. Amalei Abai, so Abai said, that's not true. You can't just change the language of the Mishnah. It says so also by Tumah. Elo Amar Abai. Abai says, Hochi Kama. The Mishnah means to say like this. The Chain, the Inyan Sirif Tumah b'Pesach, combining Tumah on Pesach, Uveshar Yom Shoshana Ika Plukta. In other words, what does that mean? It means that if it's the rest of the year, then the halacha is whether you're makbid or not makbid. By Pesach, it becomes kazayis or not kazayis. And what's the case? Hey chidami, what's the case that the Mishnah is talking about? Kegoin, the ika pachas mikabeitza oichlim. You have less than an egg of oichlim, right? So let's say it's the size of an olive, okay? And v'nogu, a tumah touched b'hai botzik, and they touch the dough that's wedged into the wall, right? So now, once it was a kazayis there, you're going to take it out anyway because you have to get rid of it. So, bePesach, the Isurei Choshev, since the Isser makes a kazayis a special item, because you're going to have to remove it, mitzdaref, then it combines all the dough that's in the side of the wall, so that becomes like an egg. We'll imagine that all the dough, that's even little pieces of dough that are not a kazayis, combined to form an egg-size piece of dough. And therefore, that egg-sized piece of dough now became tomei. It could be mitama other foods. So if another food touches that dough, it would become tomei. Because to transfer tumah, a food needs to be the size of an egg. So that's the din on Pesach. B'shari by Shoshana, it doesn't matter. The pay the Talia Misa. It depends if you are going to remove it. You don't want it there or you do want it there. Not the halacha is telling you to remove it. It's just your personal preference. In makbid olav, if you're a person that doesn't want it there, so then you're going to remove it anyway. Mitzdarif, doesn't matter what size, it combines so even if it's less than a kazayas, it combines all the dough together to become a kabeya, and it could be mitama, another food. But if you want it, you don't care that it's in the wall of the bowl. It becomes like part of the bowl. So therefore, that's what the Mishnah means. On Pesach, the halacha of Tumah changes. That's what the Mishnah means. Maskif la Rav asked the question, Mi ketani mitzdaref? Does the Mishnah talk about combining to be mitama, another piece of food? Well, choitzis ketani. The Mishnah seems to imply it has to do with a mikvah. It's a chatzitza for the bowl if it becomes tomei. So it's not talking about that halacha. It's teaching you another halacha. Ela Rava said, if you want to make the bowl become pure, in other words, you're sending the bowl into the mikvah. It's talking about the case that the bowl became tamei, and you want to take it into the mikvah. Hey chidami, kegoy the itva hachareva uboilat buli. You want that the areva the bowl became tamei. You want to dip it into the mikvah. But Pesach the isurei chashiv. But Pesach, an egg the size of an olive, makes it is a chashiva thing, is a chashiva piece, because you're going to have to remove it, because you have to be mevayer it, you have to get rid of it on Pesach. So chaitzitz, that's a chatzitza in the bowl, and it wouldn't become tar because you have a chatzitza on the bowl. But loisalkala tefillah wouldn't work. B'shari ma'isa shana, on the rest of the year, it doesn't matter. It could be the size of a punch ball. Is paid the talia. It's your preference. If you're upset that it's there and you prefer that it's not there, chaitzitz, that it's a chatzitza. If you want it there, it becomes like the bowl itself, and it's not a chatzitza. It like melts into the bowl because you're not going to remove it. You don't mind it being there. So again, the same idea. The halacha of tumah would have a different halacha on Pesach, and it's referring to being toivel the areva. One final question, and we'll come to the final way that we learn pshat in the Mishnah. Does our Mishnah say that we're talking about being metaher a bowl? It's talking about b'chein le'inyan tumah. It says, look what the Mishnah says, b'chein le'inyan tumah. If the bowl is tamei, so what are we talking about over here? So Rav Papa learns pshat. Is the question of the Mishnah is a different din. It's making the bowl tamei. to make the bowl tameh. Hey chidami, what would be that case? Kagoin, the noga sheretz behind botzeik. A sheretz touched that piece of dough. So now, let's say the dough was the size of a kazayas, and on Pesach, you're going to be forced to take a wedge and get it out of there. You're going to have to get rid of it. So, by Pesach, the isurei choshev, by the iser making it choshev, choitzitz, that it's a chatzitze. In other words, the bowl remains tahar because you only touched a food item, and the food item is a separate entity and will not be metama the bowl because a food cannot be metama a bowl. A rishon cannot be metama a keli. And tuma will not spread to the bowl. But b'shari ma'isashana, the pekepei detalia, and the rest of the year, it has to do with your preference. So in makbid olav, if you're makbid on it, that means if it's a big size, and you want to get rid of it, you don't like it in the bowl, then it's a chaitzis. Then it would be chatzitza, and the bowl would not become tameh because it's viewed as a separate entity, and you will only metama the dough or whatever it is, but not matama the bowl. But if you don't mind it being there, so let's assume that for argument's sake, it was the size of a punch bowl, but you don't mind it being there. Because it's you don't need it or you're not going to use it. So then harehu ka'areva, it becomes like the bowl itself. So even if you touch that point, that part of the bowl where the dough is, it's as if you touched the bowl itself, and it becomes tameh. New Mishnah, a very important Mishnah. Batzek hacherish, a deaf dough. What that means is like this. You know that a dough, when it becomes chametz, you can see lines on the dough. This dough looked like it started to pale, but you didn't see the lines on it. So how do you know? Maybe it became chametz, maybe it didn't. The Mishnah says, if you have a similar dough that you were working on at the same time, and then you stopped working, that dough became chametz, and your dough, the other dough, just remained like a tinge white, still, hareza asa. Even the dough that looks like it's white will now have a din like it came chametz, because it was worked on at the same time as another piece of dough, and that dough became chametz. So also this dough, even though it doesn't look chametz, it doesn't smell like chametz, it is chametz. And that's why it's called cherish, a deaf dough. Because a cherish, Rashi says a deaf person has ears, but you can never tell if a person cannot hear lo yaleinu just by looking at them. So that's this type of dough that we're talking about over here. It looks, partially that it looks like it's a little bit white, but you can't really tell if it's chametz stick or not. So you need a test source to compare it against. Now comes the very important Gemara. What happens? How do you, if you don't have another piece of dough to compare it to, how long does it take for a dough to become chametz if you stop working on it? It's if you could walk from the Migdal Nunya to Tiberia, which is mil, which is a kilometer. So then it's like that's the shear. The amount of time that takes a person to walk from a known place called Migdal Nunya to Tiberia. The name and mil. So why don't you just say the amount of time it takes to walk a kilometer? The shear of the mil. The shear of a mil is Migdal Nunya to Tiberia. It's like the shear of Migdal Nunya to Tiberia. And this is the shear that we know as 18 minutes. That generally speaking, that if you don't work on a dough and you leave it out there for 18 minutes, even though you don't see it become chametz, it has a din of chametz because that's the amount of time it takes to walk a mil. Amar Rababo, Amar Shimon ben Lakish, legabo v'latfila v'latila sedayim, you have to walk abba milim, 4 milim. What does latfila u'latila sedayim mean? So latfila, Rashi explains, that means that if you need to daven with a minyan, right, and you're going on the road, and it came time to daven, if there's a shul in front of you within 4 miles away, you have to go there and sleep there. In other words, if you're within a distance of 4 milim, you have a chiyuv to do that. And same thing, you're going to wash on bread. If you're going to find water within 4 miles in front of you, you have to go there to wash your hands, because the Chaman said you just can't sit down and not eat. Say, oh, I don't have water here. You have to push yourself to find water if it's 4 miles in front of you. If it's more than 4 miles, then you can say, then we tell the guy to put gloves on and eat the sandwich because we're not requiring him to go so far out of his way. Legabol has to do with somebody who works for another, who's kneading dough for other people. He works in a bakery, and the klei balabayis atmeim, he has to walk 4 miles to go to the mikveh to be toivel the kalim, so that when he works for somebody else, he has to make sure that the food that he's making for somebody else is tahar, but only if it's within 4 miles away. If it's more than, he doesn't have to bother himself. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Iver Amara, Iver said, Va'abba Amaba. There's actually 4 things. We learned Gabol, Tefillah, and Netilas Yadayim is 3. So what's the 4th thing? Mechadim Minai Ibud. That means, the Tanam we learned in the Mishnah, V'kulan she'ibdun oy shehilach behem kedei avoida, tahirin chutz ma'ara adam. In other words, we know that nevela is tameh, correct? But if you have skins of an animal, if soft skins of an animal, so that could also be a tumah nevela, unless it's worked on and become like a wallet or something. Then it doesn't have a kabul. Then it doesn't be mitama, because only the flesh of the animal is nevela, gives tumah, not the leather, not the skins of the animal. So how long does the skin have to work? You have to work on the skins, so then it becomes tar. So the answer is 4 miles. In other words, 72 minutes. If you put it out there and people trample on it for 72 minutes, those skins are not like nevela anymore and are tahorim and will not be mitama anything else. But the skin of a human being, right? They used to make lampshades out of human beings in the Holocaust. So there, it's always remained tama, no matter what. The kama kedei avoida, what's called working a skin. Amar Rabiani kedei hilech abar milins. 4 miles is called working the skin, a soft skin that therefore it won't have a din like a basar anymore. If it was trampled on for 72 minutes, then it will not be metama as medina vela. So we see there's 4 concepts where we use the shear of milin. So the Gemara Amar Abacha Minei Milhu Dein Chayza Apachas Migil Chayza. This is talking about Netilas Yadayim. Very interesting. Rav Acha qualified. He said, we learned before that for Netilas Yadayim, you have to go 4 miles in front of you. What about behind you? Do you have to turn around? So the din is, if it's more than a mile turnaround, you don't have to go back for water. But if it's less than a mile, you have to go back. So in other words, if it will take you more than, if it takes you 15 minutes to go backwards, not in the direction you were going, to find water to make Netilas Yadayim, in other words, you go back to the park that you were in or whatever, you're in the car and you don't have water, you have to go turn around the car, go back and wash Netilas Yadayim. But if it'll take you more than 18 minutes to go backwards, you don't have to even go backwards. Next Mishnah. Ketzad mafrishin chala betuma b'yontiv. The Mishnah says in the bottom of Memhei Amar Aleph, if a guy has a big dough on Yontiv, on Pesach, and now he has to give off challah, and the dough became tameh. Now, if the dough became tameh, so the kohen can never eat it. And therefore, giving it to the kohen, he's not going to be able to bake it, because you can't bake on Yontiv, because if you can't eat it, you can't bake it, right? And the kohen will never be able to eat it. And so therefore, and it's tumah. Now, so why don't you take off challah and leave it on the side? What's the problem with that? If you just take off challah and you piece of dough and you put it on the side, it'll become chametz. So this guy has a big problem. He can't take off the dough and put it on the side and say this will be for the kohen and let it become chametz, because it'll become chametz and you'll be over bal yaroy by matzeh. But you can't bake it either, because then you're baking shaloi l'tzarich yantiv. Because who are you baking for? For the kohen? The kohen will never be able to eat, because it's challah that became tameh. What do you do? You don't call it shem challah until you bake it. In other words, he says, bake all the matzahs. And then once you have the matzahs, right? Because in those days, they used to bake on Pesach. We discussed that. And they would bake matzahs. So you bake the dough as matzahs. So now then call one of those little matzahs challah. And that will be okay, because the fact is that even though the kohen will be able to eat that matzah, so you baked for nothing, but technically you could have called any one of those matzahs challah. So therefore, you never knew which one you're going to call as the challah. So therefore, that's not called baking for nothing on Yontif, and that's permitted. Ben Beseira gives you another idea. Take off a piece of challah of the dough, put it aside, and tatil batzoinen. Throw ice cold water on it, because when you throw cold water on it, it impedes the chametz process. So that's was Ben Beseira's idea. But Rabbi Yeshua says you don't need any idea. Just take it off, put it aside, and say this is challah for the kohen, because at the end of the day, you're not over bal yirah by matzah. Loi zehu chametz shemizoran al bal yirah by matzah. That's not chametz that you're over bal yirah by matzah. Why? Because when you give it to the kohen, when you set it aside, that challah is not yours, and you didn't give it to the kohen anyway, right? Because so therefore, and that you're not over bal yirah, because you only over bal yirah by matzah if it's your chametz, if it's your dough. But this is not dough that belongs to you. It belongs to the kohen, or it's like Hashem gifting it to the kohen. And if you're setting aside but not giving it yet to the kohen, let it become chametz, and you will not be over bal yirah by matzah. Ella, says Rabbi Yeshua, mafrishasa umanichasa ad ha'erev. You set it aside and you put it away till the nighttime. Then hechmitza. If it becomes chametz, don't worry about it. So the Gemara, what is the argument? Why does Rabbi Lezer not like Rabbi Yeshua's idea? So the answer is because lema. Would you want to say b'toivas hana kami palgi? Is the toivas hana considered like it's yours? In other words, technically, a guy who has a large piece of dough that he has to give of challah, he could give it to any kohen who wants. So that's worth money, because if somebody could, give him like a little bribe and tell him, give it to my friend the kohen, whatever matanas kahuna that you have, just give it to that kohen. So the choice of which kohen you can give it to is worth money to you, because that's something. So since that is something, the Rabbi Lezer saw a toivas hana moment. That toivas hana, that you can decide which kohen to give it to, that's worth money. And if that's worth money, that's like your money. So if I set it aside to the kohen, that piece of challah is always considered somewhat mine, and therefore I'm over by yirah by a matzah. And that's why Rabbi Lezer doesn't like Rabbi Yeshua's idea. Rabbi Yeshua saw toivas hana einamon. The fact that you can choose which kohen to give it to, that's not considered a value. It's not considered like you have any ownership in it. And the fact is you don't have ownership in it. Once you set it aside to the kohen, it's not yours, and it's not the kohen, because he didn't even decide which kohen to give it to. That's why Rabbi Yeshua holds that you could just take off it as is, as a dough, and just set it aside and let it become chametz. That's what the Gemara thought what the machlokes is. So the Gemara answers, loy, not so. It's kuliyame, everybody holds, soivas hanoah einamon. The fact that you can decide who to give it to is not considered money. Bahacha over here, bahoyil kami palgi. The fact is that can you be shoyal? There's a possibility that you can be shoyal on your neder and not make it challah. In other words, the Rabbi Lezer Saba Amrina Hoyel. You do say that you say the word since. In other words, the iboya itcha, since the possibility exists that you can turn it, you can make it not challah, mamaynahu. In other words, when you take off a piece of dough and you set it aside as challah, Rabbi Lezer holds that min adin, a person could go to a chacham and say, you know what, I regret giving him this piece of dough. I want to give him another piece of dough. So technically, there's a possibility to take out the kedusha challah of this if you're shoyal on your neder. If you say that I don't want it to be the challah, so then it doesn't have a din of challah anymore, and it becomes yours. So Rabbi Lezer says every piece of dough that you set aside as challah is technically yours, because technically you can go to a chacham and turn it not being challah by being shoyal on your neder and giving something else. So therefore, Rabbi Lezer doesn't like this idea of separating it aside, because it's considered not your money, and therefore you'll be over by your raw. That's what he says. Since Amrina Hoyel, you could always regret setting aside this piece of dough and be shoyal on your neder and not say, and this piece should not be challah, so then it's always considered mamaynahu. It's considered your money, and you'll be oivel bal yoroi bayimatze. Rabbi Yeshua says loy amin and hoyel. You don't say this idea hoyel. In other words, you didn't. At the end of the day, you set this piece as challah, and you didn't be shoyal on your neder. So therefore, it is what it is, and we look at it as it is right now. As it is right now, it's not yours anymore because you called this challah, and you didn't give it to the kohen, so it's not the kohen's anymore. So then, how could you be over bal yoroi bayimatze? It's not your money. It's not the kohen's money. It's just out there somewhere. And therefore, you could just leave it there on the side and let it become chametz. I want to stop over here because the next sugya is just one connected sugya from Itmar, and that's it. So we'll leave it for tomorrow, Mitzvah Shem.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, very good.
Thank you.
But to end early once in a while. Yeah.
No.
Take care. Good night, everybody.
Okay. Good night.